All right, welcome back to the podcast. Today we have a very special guest on. You've known his work for years and years with a lot of multiple, very big veteran brands. Air Force veteran, now author of the new book, All Your Friends Are Imaginary, available April 2nd, not on April Fools. We just talked about it. Gary Stevens, thanks for coming on, brother.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, man. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very excited to have you on for this. Having a fellow creative on is always nice. It's like, it's just awesome. So, yeah, man, let's just fire right into it. What was, what inspired you? I know you went into the Air Force, and then how did graphic design kind of, get into your life? I mean, I was an artist growing up, quote unquote. I drew a ton, loved creative writing. So, and wanted to be a filmmaker since I was a kid. Was that something that kind of jumped at you when you were younger? And then what kind of led you into, joining the Air Force and then the career that you've had?
Absolutely. Yeah. When I was younger, I drew a lot. I painted. You couldn't keep me away from the stuff. I built models. If there was a creative endeavor, I would take it. And the truth is, when it came time, I was 18 years old and I wanted to go into the military. I wanted to do something different. We all go in the military for different reasons, and mine was a change of course. And interestingly enough, when I was in basic training, I injured myself. I broke my foot on one of the obstacles, good old Air Force guy, not understanding how to navigate. And because of that, the job that I went in for, which originally was going to be like airborne communications, essentially setting up an AWAC, listening to a computer, and the beeps and squeaks and whatnot, I was disqualified because I couldn't pass a flight physical, broken foot. Mm-hmm. So they made me reclassify, and literally it was like a list of 10 things. And at the very bottom of the list was graphic design, because that was the last thing I put. I'm like, I'll never get it. 5 minutes later, this master sergeant comes over and says, "Hey man, that's the tech school. It starts in like a week. That's where you're going." I was like, okay, guess we're doing this. And immediately, like a week later, crunched up everything. I flew up to Fort Meade, Maryland, where I went to DINFOS for 3 months. And then I went to what ultimately ended up being pretty much my entire duty assignment, which was Herbert Field in Florida. And
that's wild. That's so the Air Force has a no shit graphic design school.
They did, which also plays a part in my later Air Force career. But yeah, for the first 5 years, I want to say 5 years of my career, I was a graphic designer. And then through that, I also had opportunities to learn how to do like photography, public affairs, so writing articles every so often, did video animation, video work. Like if there was something to be learned or done creatively, like I just found a connection with it, and I was willing to learn as much about all of it as I possibly could.
That's awesome. I never hate on the Air Force. I love the Air Force. I think that's amazing. It was like, hey, you want to be set up for life? Join the Air Force. We have graphic design schools. Well, that's awesome. So, one, what year was that? And two, I don't know why. I just think of like, being a Marine and like the classes we were taught. What years was that? But then also like, what were those classes like? I mean, typically people go to like liberal arts colleges or they go to whatever, and it's just like, hey, welcome to the class. Let's start drawing. Like what was a military structured class of graphic design? Like, what was that like?
So it was multi-branch. So we actually had Marines, Navy, Air Force, everybody, Army as well. And so DINFOS is like a universal school. So if you were public affairs, you were broadcasting, you were, video, whatever it was, you all went to DINFOS. And so for me, the first half of the course was traditional art. So, classically trained, as they would say. So you have to make sure that you can master those mediums. So we did charcoal, we did watercolor, which by the way, better people for that one. We did pencil painting, we did pastel. Like they literally impressed upon us the need to understand the basics of art, which for me, fortunately, I already had that ingrained from childhood. So that was an easier portion of it. What was new to me was the second half of the course, which is all of your digital curriculum. So that's when you're learning programs like Adobe After Effects, or not After Effects, but Adobe Illustrator, Adobe Photoshop. And to age myself here, to use a phrase, this was 2002. So this was Adobe Photoshop 5.0. And that was a new thing. That was the big thing, was Adobe 5.0. And I just remember the curriculum was fun. You know, we had to do self-portraits, we had to do military, we had to do a grenade. So we had to learn how to make and model a mesh grenade in like Adobe Illustrator. And it was great because it taught you all this practical design knowledge. And I was young enough that, you know, I had all the energy in the world. So I would spend every waking moment I had trying to learn as much as I could.
That's all. I mean, honestly, that's so cool. I date myself too. I graduated '05, but I remember those Adobe suites. Not even, I mean, I remember my buddy was pretty savvy at the internet. I mean, we were only like, I mean, 2002, that was my sophomore year, or, freshman, sophomore year of high school.
Yep.
But I remember before that, he had gotten a hold of Adobe Premiere, and people were like, there's a Premiere. Yeah, it used to be Premiere, and then it went into Premiere Pro, and that was like a big leap in like 2003 or four. And we had like a hacked version of it, and it was. But I remember those suites though. I remember that like a lot of people, this generation doesn't understand. Like it's all subscription model, but back then, dude, it was a big deal. You drop cash on the Photoshop package software.
Yeah.
Everything was. It was a ready to go launched software. And then there was updates
Absolutely.
along the way,
Yep. It was like $2,600 if I remember correctly.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So, I'm not crazy. Cause I remember seeing those price tags, like the master suite was like 26. Yeah. And then people were like, you're insane. That's so crazy. I was like, I swear to God, I saw that. And this, and okay, I'm glad you can like back me up. It's I don't want that to be like a false memory. You know what I mean? Like, I was like, I swear to God, these used to be insanely expensive. Yeah.
And then I'll say I was at a thrift store a couple of years ago, and interesting enough, somebody turned in an old copy. I think it was like Photoshop 7.0. So like it's up on the shelf, and my wife and I were looking at it because she was a broadcaster, graphic designer as well, and we're just laughing because we also forgot just how big those boxes were and how heavy they were, because they not only had the software, they had all the books that came with them, and they were these like, do you remember them? They were like these monolithic boxes, which I thought was just hilarious. But I wanted to point out one thing because you had mentioned Adobe Premiere. So, fun fact with the Air Force, like you said before, the graphic design's a career field, right? It's kind of a weird thing, but you would think, okay, we got to do certificates and posters and all kinds of stuff. So the Air Force developed a wartime mission, which for us was called WSV, Weapon System Video. And essentially what we did was we would deploy with intelligence units. For me specifically, it was with AC-130 gunships and with like the 555th EFS out of Albiano, Italy, which was my fun deployment to Balad. And our job was to take all the video footage from like drone strikes, from aircraft strikes, fighters, whatever, and declassify that information so that could go onto like Fox News or CNN or whoever. And then also so they could brief the Secretary of Defense, like whenever they'd have, specific strikes and specific target packages. And so, yeah, I was like one of 4, maybe 5 people in the entire Air Force that had that designation, because I ended up having to be the guy to train those people. So they would come to our base so I could train them on that mission. And I always joked that I was a graphic designer with a top secret clearance, which I was.
Yeah, it's awesome.
So it's like, why do I have this? Oh yeah, right. So that was kind of my I would say interjection into the world of like Premiere, was the software that they used. Mm-hmm. And they would use this old, and I'm sure you know what I'm talking about here, these little Hi8 boxes, these little like old like mini DV and Hi8 boxes, and you would use a was it FireWire card?
Yeah. I love you're talking my language, bro.
Like into this laptop, and you're like pulling videos, and it was wild.
And you had to, and you couldn't just like drag drop. You had to play it, and then it played itself out. So so if it's a 25-minute video, it's a 25-minute. Just sit there and let it. It was a capture card. So it was just it just captured, and you would do that. I think through Premiere, correct?
You could do it. Premiere.
Yep.
And you would batch capture stuff. And my first deployment.
Before we keep going with the podcast, I want to drop this week's discount code for Nine Line Apparel. We're not just a brand, we're a lifestyle that celebrates the spirit of freedom, courage, and American values. Go check out our gear, including hoodies, glassware, flags, jackets, hats, patches, and much more. All material is ethically sourced, so every shirt you buy is free of slave labor. As a veteran-owned and operated company, we also take pride in giving back to those who've served. Your purchase helps us contribute to charitable initiatives supporting veterans and first responders. This episode's discount code is GSA for 20% off Nine Line Apparel products. Golf Sierra Alpha 20, not 10, not 20, 20%, not 25 because that's a bit excessive. So get over to the store and get yourself 20% off your next purchase. While you're at it, like, listen, and subscribe to the Nine Line Apparel Podcast for future discount codes and more conversations with amazing guests like today. Now back to the podcast.
Which was a K2. It was all VHS still.
Oh, Jesus.
Everything was VHS, which was, and the best part was one of the reasons that we had to pull all the footage was because we were kind of in an isolated place. Obviously, K2, if you know anything about it. And so they would reuse the tapes. So we would digitize everything, and then they would have to record over the tapes because they just didn't have enough.
That's awesome. What was K2? Was that Kyrgyzstan? Or
no, that was Uzbekistan. It was Karshi-Khanabad. Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. It's Uzbekistan. Okay, yeah. Because we flew through, Kyrgyzstan. I think we flew.
Yeah,
Manas Air Base.
Manas Air Base. Yep.
Manas Air Base. Loved it. Great. And we were there for like 24 hours, but loved it. Yeah. Naturally, it's Air Force. I was like, every podcast I talk about Air Force, I was like, I love the Air Force. I think they're amazing. Like they're the best people ever. And but that's wild. So then I love how you guys had to like clear the VHS tapes and be like, okay, we got to reuse. We have to reuse.
We got to reuse this, guys. Here you go.
Yeah, that's wild. So then back in the day, I guess I don't have to get into details, but I guess technology changed way much. So they used to have high 8 or VHS tapes on like aircraft, or was that the feed coming down? Okay, so this is like direct aircraft footage. From these strikes or whatever.
Yeah, aircrew would come off the plane, they'd come into the skiff, and they would immediately hand you the footage to start digitizing. And so, and it was a fun job. I mean, aside from, just sometimes the tapes would be really long, and I'm not really complaining. Obviously, you're like editing video, deployed.
Yeah.
The most interesting part was whenever they do jamming, and you just have to listen. So you'd have to listen to tapes over and over again. So you might have some really long days because there would be key points, especially with fighter jets, where they would jam their signals, and so you'd just be hearing and you just have to pull all those clips and digitize and get them out. And there usually was a pretty strict timeline from the time that they landed to the time that had to be up to like the talk, so that they could brief that into the general of the day or whoever they were going to talk to.
Mm-hmm.
So
like what was the typical length of that time? I mean, missions can last forever, or was it just like specific strikes or something like that? I mean,
it was pretty much any mission for the most part, especially if there was something significant. There was definitely a lot of reconnaissance stuff that we would pull. And then the strikes were always the most important, though, because those are the ones that get briefed to higher ups. And then obviously, as kind of I had alluded to earlier, we knew the American public kind of wanted to know what was going on. That's when you see those video clips where like the coordinates and other information are blurred out. That's what we had to do so that we could transmit those clips to the news stations to give people awareness.
Nice. So I've probably seen your clips on ogrish.com
somewhere.
Or something like that. It's somewhere along the line.
Yeah.
Part of the moto videos the Marine Corps had was the blanked out time frame or whatever like that. So how long did you end up doing that mission, or was that just for the deployment, or did you end up doing that kind of like for a few years and then back to graphic design? Like how did that all work?
It was just for deployments. It was just the wartime mission. So I had my first deployment to K2, and then I had deployment to Balad, and then I want to call it a deployment, but it was really like a month-long mission to South America. We were in Colombia, which I think is a pretty funny story, or interesting story. Not funny really, but that was like the most interesting because that's when the first time we had converted to digital hard drives. Ooh. And there were 3 American journalists who had been kidnapped, and the FARC, if anybody knows what that is, Armed Revolutionary Forces of Colombia, which is like a terrorist organization, they had captured these dudes. And so we were doing air reconnaissance to try to figure out where they were. And so I believe we were mission 6 of 14, if that tells you how long it took to repatriate these guys. Mm-hmm. But it was an awesome deployment because, I mean, it's Colombia. And for me, like most of the people there, actually, I would say 99% didn't speak our core language. And so it's like, hey, how much Spanish did I really retain from high school? Can I eat? And it was cool because we learned how to integrate this new technology, right? Because hard drives external were kind of a new thing. Like, again, we're millennials, so we're seeing the dawn of all this technological growth. And so now they're putting these external hard drives in aircraft, and that came with its own set of challenges, we'll say, but it was a huge learning experience. And then that was my last deployment for that job, because then I think it was about 6 months later, the Air Force decided that just wasn't enough, and they decided to do career field elimination, and so they actually got rid of our job.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Like the graphic design aspect, or that?
Yep.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. So they tried this whole thing where they converged everything together. So public affairs, video, photo, graphics, we were all working together.
Oh, okay, got it.
And so I could one day, end up working doing photography. I could one day do some video stuff wherever they wanted to put us and wherever we were interested in learning. There was a point in time when I worked for wing staff. So I got hand selected to be the one graphic designer with one photographer, one videographer, and we worked for the wing commander, which was actually, I think, probably one of the highest honors I've ever had, because we literally were like right across the office from him. And so anytime there was a high value thing, that was him coming to us. But that was all within the last year, and it just wasn't enough. And so they did career field elimination, and I was given essentially two choices because of two critically manned career fields. One of which was Tactical Air Control Party, which is TACP, JTACs, and the other one was intelligence. I'll just say this. At the time, I still am married to the same woman, and I knew if I'd gone probably the JTAC route, she wouldn't have been quite as supportive. God love her. And I understand why. And
I get that. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And then there was the intelligence side, which I was kind of already pre-fit for, and that's the path they selected for me. And so that's where I ended up going. So I ended up going from graphics to actually doing intelligence, which is where I finished out my Air Force career.
Nice. And so how many years was that in total? Like you did graphic design and everything?
9.5 years.
9.5 years.
Yep.
So that was weird. So they were like, so they only gave you an option of JTAC or Intel, but not PAO? Would they,
I tried out for public affairs, and I will tell anybody here, I have a face for radio, which is funny now that we're here on radio with this face.
Yeah.
But at the time, I didn't have the cadence down for how broadcasters speak, so I simply just didn't pass the audition. And so that was like the first step. And then the next step was more of like, hey, we've got critically manned things we want you to look at. And there was two that I was just aptly qualified for, because at the time, I was also a PTL, which in the Air Force is a training leader for fitness. And so I could handle the rigors and the physical demands of the one, and I had the clearance already for the other. So it was more of like which one do you want to do? We can help you. We can, put you in for both. And when I went in for intelligence, that wing commander who I had worked for previously, I like to tell people the story. This is my one like gloat thing that I will tell people because I'm proud of it. But he wrote my letter of recommendation after he made 1 star. So my reference letter to get into intelligence school was written by a general, which I still have a framed copy of.
Oh, that's awesome. That's great. That's pretty cool. So then, so you move into Intel, how was that compared to, like you said, the graphic design? Because I feel like that's just a completely different field, kind of what you're from what you're doing.
It can be. It depends, because I was more admittedly the visual side of things. So oftentimes when they'd have like these extensive briefs, I would be the guy that would kind of clean things up and make things look nice. And I would take technical information and kind of break it down. So when you have something's top secret and secret whatnot, you just clean it up so it's more legible. And so there were some definitely comparisons to some degree, but 75% of it was wholly different. It was setting up a laptop and talking to a crowd of people, hey, get ready to deploy. Here's all the things that can hurt you. Have fun. And that was kind of the weekly cadence. And then otherwise it was, printing off top secret reports. And it's not like Hollywood where everybody's like, oh man, you're in intelligence. It's got to be crazy. You're like Jason Bourne. It's like, no, man, it's sitting in PowerPoint all day long.
Yeah.
In an office with no windows.
Yeah. No, and that's what I mean. I as I moved on to my National Guard career for a few years after the Marine Corps, we worked with the Intel guys a lot more, at the division level. So yeah, I've seen that. It's not real sexy. Everyone's just doing PowerPoints and looking at papers, and that's why I was asking. It's like, to go from like fun working with Premiere, designing, to be like, hey, we're doing reports, and whatnot.
Yes.
But yeah. And
but
so
I will say, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, you go ahead.
No, but what I was going to say though is that even while I was in the intelligence community, outside of that, I still maintained doing creative work. So I was always, even when I get off work from 10-hour day, I would still go and create things, whether it was photography or video or building models for productions or whatever it was. Like we would spend a lot of time still maintaining that like core knowledge so you don't get rusty. So even in that, I was still finding that creative outlet because it was that important to me to maintain, because I also knew pretty early on with the intelligence job, like it wasn't a bad place and there were great people. It just wasn't for me. And I knew that pretty early on. And so I realized that when I was going to be post-military, like I knew what skills I wanted to have so that I could get the jobs that I wanted. And those are the things I focused my off time on, was gaining that knowledge and those skills to be able to do that.
Nice. That's awesome. And so, like I said, you do your 9.5 years, what kind of made you're like, hey, this isn't for me anymore. What was that transition like then, especially as I love talking with creatives because the mindset's completely different. Like you know what your skills are, it's not just like, hey, I think we're going to do this or that or contract, or whatever. It's like you're kind of like your head's in a different space. Like, hey, I'm a graphic designer. There's say a lot of jobs, I mean, it depends on what time you got out, but it's a different type of mentality. What was that like when you kind of made that jump and decision?
So about a year and a half before I got out, I kind of resolved not to re-up. I had my oldest kid and it was just kind of waning on me, that the job required a lot of hours and I kind of wanted to be around for my kid. They say kids change things and they really do. And then I became pretty disillusioned. I'll be the first to tell people I became pretty disillusioned with the military for the last 6 months I was in. And Air Force was doing this huge force reduction and I had been injured and there was some other stuff. And so I had this really awesome chief master sergeant who was like, hey man, I think we might be able to get you out sooner. And so they did this involuntary separation. And so I just kind of met the factors. And so that's actually why I was only 9.5 versus the full 10. Was they did an involuntary step and they're like, hey, we'll give you severance pay. You can keep pretty much all your benefits for the next 6 months. You just can't be in the military. And I was like, well, my youngest kid is about to be born. I feel like this is a great opportunity for me to just kind of spend some time and decompress because as well as anybody knows, that's a long time in the military and it's hard. And you really do end up needing that time to kind of decompress. So once I got out, I started doing my private business stuff, like working for myself and then being there to raise my kid. Because at the time, my wife was also deploying and she was still in. And so I wanted to be that guy. And it was a great change of mindset because it truly told me during that time that I'd made the right decision. And I had zero regrets about anything that had happened before that. And also, notwithstanding, when I was in intelligence, it was actually when I met Jared Taylor, who I know you know from Black Rifle and everything else. And so, funny story there, my wife actually did have the right voice. And so she got retrained into broadcast. And so she, got reassigned back to the base. And so she was working in a shop. And one day this guy comes in and he says his name is Jared Taylor. And he tells my wife, like, yeah, I want to learn video. I want to do this and do that. Because he was in TACP and he was doing recruiting and he wanted to learn about their gear and equipment. And my wife was like, hey, we're kind of busy. Maybe talk to my husband and me, of course, And I was like, okay, who's this guy? He said, oh, his name's Jared. He says he's done all these things and blah, blah, blah. And of course, I go on the internet. I can't find this guy. Yeah, no, I'm not going to talk to him. Whatever. About 6 months later, he comes back in. He's like, hey, I thought you said your husband was going to call me. And so my wife comes home and she's like, hey, dude, just call this guy. Turns out we lived less than a mile from each other. He literally lived down the road and to the right and had no idea. And so we started working together. And that's where like our first business venture came from, which was BotStick. And so when I transitioned out of the military, I immediately jumped into that full time. So we were doing all kinds of creative work for a wide range of clients, like right out the gate.
Yeah. And that, what years was that? Because I think I remember seeing the Jared Taylor artwork, or not artwork, but like your stuff with like, I remember I've heard some of his story in that background, which again always makes me laugh. Like, you're not the first. Like the Air Force, it seems like they want you to start your own like successful business while you're in. Because everyone I've talked to is like, yeah, I started the business while I was in, and they gave me time off too. And I'm like, I was like, you're active duty Air Force, and it was like they're, and that's why again I love the Air Force. It always feels like they're super supportive of like any outside endeavor, to like, I don't know, make a business or something like that. But yeah, so what years was that? Because I think I remember seeing some of that stuff. Like, was it gun magazines? Was it,
Yeah, it was. Yeah. We started, I want to say 2008, I think is when we initially met. And then we've pretty much been doing stuff on and off like since then. So if you can imagine, we're at 16 years now, 17. So we've been doing stuff for a long time now. And, it's been great. Honestly, it's been some of the most rewarding and some of the best work we've done. And I'm pretty sure the years are off there, by the way. But we started off with some magazine work. There was a magazine called Taxim Magazine, and I owe a lot of credit to those guys for giving us our first break and like how do you do ads and creatives, for a magazine. And then it just grew from there where we did logos. Like we did the first logo for like Funker 530 for people that have heard of those guys.
Oh yeah.
That was that was our first big break. And then we did a lot of comedic stuff, which is what we got known for. We did a, bikini calendar, I like to say. That was our first big, like, splash that we were doing things. And it sold pretty well. It did well for itself, but it got us recognized as, like, okay, these guys are doing different things. Because that was kind of Jared and I's, like, opinion, is that we wanted to disrupt the system. We wanted to do things that were different. And for me, that stemmed all the way back from being a graphic designer in the military. Like, I love the job. I will never put it down. It was just, there's a lot of things that you can learn that just don't apply when you're in that environment. Like, you just can't use them. And so this gave me an opportunity to finally put those things into play. And so, we would take our favorite video game franchises when we recreate their posters, or we recreate film posters, because we just wanted to know, hey, can we relight this photo? Can we, find that font? Can we do this thing?
That's awesome. That's like, and I agree with you. That's the reverse engineering. Can you kind of, and I do that with like filmmaking as well. As like, I see shots as like, can I remake that shot?
Yep.
Or what does that lighting look like with this scene? I want to recreate it. And by doing that reverse engineering and then doing, either, it's the kind of the same, but it's your style, or it's a different style. You kind of, you sharpen your skills. And even if you're not doing it for a client, it's still something that's like, hey, it's another tool in my toolbox, and it's another just repetition of, hey, trigger time for what comes down the road eventually, when clients are paying you and you're like, all right, I can figure out how we can pull this off.
Yep.
And like I said, I think that's awesome with the graphic design world, is because, I think everyone wants to do everything by themselves, but I, like, oh, I can do this. I'll create my own logo. And I've done that myself, and I know I'm just not good enough. It's like, I can get it to 25%, I'm like, oh, Jesus. All right. But when you truly see, like, we work together, especially with like my embed series, it's like, I see your work on that, even with it's just that look. You showed me a few and I'm like, fuck, man, that's just, I can't even think, you come something that's just like, I didn't even think of that. It's like, awesome. Like, I love that, like it just comes together, the tone, and it's an amazing skill set. And so when you guys are working together, and I do remember those kind of years. I mean, it was a different time. I see a lot of the tactical magazines. I was buying those all the time. I'm sure I ran into your guys' ads, going through all that in the 2008, 9, 10, even more era, of all that. And so what was that? I mean, that's awesome. I mean, that's a great success story of like, hey, getting out, jumping into it. And you guys did that for, I mean, so I know Black Rifle didn't fire up till 2014. Did you work then with Article 15 clothing, or how did you? So
I transitioned. That? So I was working for a lot of different clients, and so that was like I love doing that. So from like 2011 when I got out till about 2014, I did the freelance thing where I was just working with a lot of different people. Jared and I, we did advertising. I mean, I can't even begin to unfold like how much we did in those 3 years. It's an amazing amount of work that was accomplished, and it was an intense number of years. I mean, there was definitely like 4 hour sleep nights and things like that, but it was great. And, I did 3 years, and it was 4 hour sleep nights and things like that, but it was great. And, 4 hour sleep nights and things like that, but it was great. And, 4 hour sleep nights and things like that, but it was great. And, 4 hour sleep nights and things like that, but it was great. And, 4 hour sleep nights and things like that, but it was great. And, 4 hour sleep nights and things like that, but it was great. And, 4 hour sleep nights and things like that, but it was great. And, 4 hour sleep nights and things like that, but it was great. And, 4 hour sleep nights and things like that, but it was great. And, 4 hour sleep nights and things like that, but it was great. And, 4 hour sleep nights and things like that, but it was great. And, 4 hour sleep nights and things like that, but it was great. And, 4 hour sleep nights and things like that, but it was great. And, 4 hour sleep nights and things like that, but it was great. And, 4 hour sleep you know, it just went from one thing to another. And then eventually, yes, to your point, working with like Article 15 and doing their advertising for like their t-shirts and stuff, like doing their end plates, working with some of the fitness people like Derek Whita, who they had attached to them for a while. Like I designed a bunch of his apparel at that time. I worked for, Fetchheimer through one of their brands, Vertex. And that was actually really, really great. I worked for B5 Systems, which I'm still like great friends with the owner, today. He's an awesome dude. And it just taught me a lot about like, packaging design and designing for the customer and creating this environment, which, set me up to inevitably work for, Black Rifle.
And so some, I mean, like I said, some of those, the stuff that you're talking about, did you end up doing most of the Article 15? Like, I'm sure there's a bunch of shirts out there that like, I'm just like, all of it's rushing back to me, all the memories, from that era. And I remember like, man, this is some cool stuff. This is awesome, and, was there some that really popped out that you're like, hey, this really helped set us apart from everybody else? Like a few designs that you did that were like, those were bangers.
So as far as the apparel design goes, I honestly only designed one or two of the apparel pieces. I was mainly on the advertising side, just to be fair. So the art fell on the truly talented guys. They came in and did a lot of those. And I think one of those guys we still work with today. So due respect where that belongs. That was Matt and JT working directly with illustrators and Cody. But for me, there were definitely a few that stood out. There was one that was like a bushel of eggs, and there was like a grenade inside of it, which I thought was great. Or it was like rounds. There was definitely some wild stuff that, obviously led into the kind of the irreverent sense of humor that, Black Rifle eventually adopted as well. Cause obviously a lot of people that came from Art 15 ended up there.
Yeah. And then, anything even outside of that, like, like said, some bigger clients that like, we don't know, that's something that's like, oh shit, that really, like even just you personally, like your career that, because I've worked on stuff that I know a lot of people don't know, but for me, it's like, man, that was an amazing experience. That was, one of my best times that I had.
I would say not necessarily a client, but I was, no kidding, I was sitting at my dining room table and I decided to start a magazine, which for anybody who wants to do that, I don't recommend it unless you have a lot of effort and time and energy. But it was fun because it taught me all these different things. And I worked with a lot of different companies through that. And believe it or not, even like working from home, and it was a free magazine, I still managed to sell copies. People still managed to buy advertising, like it paid for itself. So for as long as it was in business, it did great. And through that, I met a lot of different companies. And one of which was a guy named Dave Roden, who's an awesome dude. If anybody knows him in the industry, he's got like these massive, red-haired chops that he's famous for. He owns a flavored beard now. And he was at the time working for 511. And he actually worked for Tom Davin, who also went on to work for Black Rifle. But while he was there, he was working for Tom Davin. And interestingly enough, they had sent us some gear to do photography for Art 15. And then for me personally, I was allowed to do some stuff. And they sent me this full kit. And I was sitting in my, kitchen working on the magazine one day. And I just had this stupid idea of like putting all the gear on and filling all the ammo pouches with like Nas energy drinks and candy bars. And so that's where the keyboard operator photo came from that gets used like all over the place now. It started honestly as just a joke in my living room. And my wife actually took that photograph. So I want to give her the credit. But yeah, there's like this now famous photo of me holding a keyboard and, fully kitted out with my beard that was like, about 12 inches long. And that's actually like my favorite thing. Not because it's so famous. That's actually not why. Why it gives me so much delight is when people will send it to me and then they'll argue with me as to who it is. Or they'll tell me like, oh, that's my best friend. Yeah, no, I took that photo in my kitchen. I'm like, no, you didn't. No, that's me. It's like, no, man, here's another photo from another angle from that exact same photo shoot. Like,
yeah.
But that one just for me, I love seeing it just to see like how different people use it to make whatever argument they're going to. But that truly was like my favorite, because it's usually the thing that you think the least about is usually the thing that becomes the most interesting to people. Mm-hmm. Jared and I, a few years beforehand, were down in Texas, and we had this former Delta guy who was doing a photo shoot with us. And, he's just, jacked to the nines, tatted out, bald dude, super cool guy. and he's kitted out, and we're doing some photos for a company I was working for, and this like tailless kitten just wanders into the garage as we're shooting. And so we get this bright idea. We're like, oh, we have to get a photo with this cat, which fast forward, Jared still has this cat, by the way. And this is like 11 years later. But at the time, it was this tiny, tiny little cat. And so we took this now famous photo of this like jacked up dude with this tiny little cat sitting on his vest, which is the tactical kitty, which I'm sure several people would probably remember from our days of Article 15 as well.
Yeah, I think I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's another one I'm fairly proud of, because it's just the thing where it's like, it's in the spur of the moment. It's just fun. It's exciting. And those are the things I live for the most. Like, I love what I do, and I love, most of the things I've done. But it's just those little moments that I feel like are the best, because they're the ones that just kind of keep coming back.
Mm-hmm. And so then when you guys, so you've done a lot of photography,
yes,
love graphic design, and then, things are really picking up. Was there any lulls, in that, or it just sounds like you're just going balls to the wall as soon as you got out, or,
yeah.
go.
No,
especially evolving right into, you said the 2014, and, BRCC gets established, and then it's like off to the races, Yeah,
there was no lull. I would say the only lull I've had was after making the decision to leave Black Rifle. I took a 4-month sabbatical so I could spend the summer with my kids, mm-hmm. because it had been, and it's not a bad 20 years. It's just had been 20 years of just nonstop, just going. And I felt like my kids deserved that from me. Like, just that mm-hmm. solid every day, we're going to hang out, we're going to go do the things we haven't been able to do kind of time. But prior to that, no. I mean, even I'll tell this story about how I got connected with Black Rifle. So my wife and I, anybody knows Starving Artist. Like, I've actually been one where things were tough. We sold everything we owned. So, like, we went through that gambit, as many artists do. And we had hit that point where it's like, I don't know what the next phase is, and my wife, God love her, she was very supportive and said, I know you got this. And so we saved up a bunch of money. We moved out of the place we were living in, which was kind of like not the best. You know how it has been when you're trying to make, you really want to make it. And we finally saved enough. So the day we get this phone call, they're like, hey, you got the place. I'm like, yes. It was this nice house. It was in a better neighborhood, better schools for the kids. I get a call from my boss at the time. He's like, hey, man, we can't afford to pay you anymore. Like, I get the one call, and literally an hour later, I'll never forget it. Like, I get 8 a.m., hey, you got the place. 9 a.m., hey, you don't have a job anymore. And I'm like, well, mm-hmm. damn. And so about 3 months prior to that, I had met Evan Hafer. And I met him the first time that Jared and Matt met him, like the first time he had ever flown out. Kind of similar to how I had met Matt Best. The first time he had ever flown down to Texas, I just happened to be there. And so I was talking to Evan, and I was like, hey, man, sorry, I've already got a job. Can't really do anything with you. Fast forward now, we're back to current day. I just got laid off. So that afternoon, I called Evan, and I was like, hey, man, you still want to work together? And he's like, yeah. He's like, but I have 3 stipulations. He's like, you have to be here within a week. You have to be ready to interview when you get here. And he's like, if I hire you, you got to be ready to work that same day. And I've forever respected him for being like very pointed about those things. And he kept to every word of it. And so literally within 3 days, I drove to Utah and I interviewed for the job. And then we started doing stuff. And originally it wasn't Black Rifle. Originally it was another business adventure. And without going too far into it, I'll just say, at that time, a lot of banks weren't really interested in that type of, work being done. And so they were holding up and freezing funds and assets, as a lot of, people in the gun and firearms industry are learning banks can do that. And
was that Ready Man or whatever it was?
No,
or
Twist Rate. Yeah. It was this company.
Okay, got it. Okay.
Which was basically crowdfunding for like fitness and some gun stuff and other things. And the banks just saw fit to like freeze assets. And so they couldn't get the money out for the people. And Evan had been roasting coffee, and he was doing the Ready Man thing. I mean, we had all come out. I want to say, like, even Marty came out at one point. We were all hanging out in this giant house. And I remember when Evan made the decision to go like full bore into Black Rifle. And admittedly, I was still a contractor at that time. So I like to tell people, like, I was not an employee from day one. I started my career with them as the graphics dude, contract, living in Colorado. Business was in Utah. I didn't move out here until 2017 officially. And that's when I, officially joined the company as an employee. But yeah, dude, it was a whirlwind. It was a whirlwind. And I will tell you for me, I'll just age it from the ages of 33 to like 36, 37. It was a wild 4 years.
Yeah, and like I said, it seems like it. I had known of them. Like I had known of the Matt Best stuff until I came to company in 2020.
Yeah.
But I remember we're all in that sphere. So it's kind of like I've always kept not in a distance, but it's like, oh yeah, I remember the magazines, I remember the YouTube videos, I remember this that I remember they're advertising on whatever early podcast days too, or not say early, but earlier podcast days, in the early YouTube days, or not early, but like when things were coming into their own, they had been around, but then things are starting to come into their own, and yeah, I do remember that. Yeah, I know. And that's wild. And so you came on as the graphic designer. So what's your, I would say, what's your claim to fame, but like, what's some of the main ones so the audience knows like, hey, that was Gary's design, this one, that they can be like, oh shit, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. So I would say the main claim to fame, I would say, is the company logo. So the thing that sits on pretty much every product.
the main thing. I love that. That's awesome. Yep.
But at the same time, I do respect to, even Evan as well, because we worked on that together. We spent a lot of late nights going back and forth. So, I do get credited as the design guy who did it, but it's like most things I've done in life. It's a collaboration between people because, we sat together and we like figured it out over days and days and days of moving this here and moving that there. And so, I would say that's something that I'm probably pretty well known for. I think, when we'd ever do the geisha bags, those have always been fun and entertaining just because they're so ludicrous, and I would say the one we did last where the graffiti and stuff was on it, I think it's like one of my favorite things I've ever designed, probably professionally ever. But that was also because, we got to showcase the fact that all the graffiti on the bag we did by hand. Like we literally would sit in my office with poster boards and Sharpies, and we would just do it, and then we'd photograph it, and then we convert it into an element we could use in the file. Like that's how granular we would get creatively sometimes, is like if we didn't want to do it digitally, we would physically do it and photograph it and put elements together. So that one, the ECS products, I usually had a hand in some way, whether it was designing the layout or, working with the creative guys. But there's a lot, that's not arrogance. It's just, there was just so many things that we did. It's hard to really sit back and go, okay, there's definitely some collaborations we did I'm super proud of, like the one with Amazon, with the show, the terminal list, which was awesome.
Yep.
It was honestly like one of the more simplistic bags, but the way it ended up working out was it was purely a graphic design bag and not illustrated. It's just what they preferred, because we had done a fully illustrated version, and then we had my graphic kind of design version, and then we just collaborated, myself and this other artist, Chris Hunt, and we just put it together, and it was pretty cool.
Yeah. I worked on the podcast for that one.
Actually.
Awesome. So yeah. So the producers and then like two of the actors or whatever, it was work with Ironclad. I was the editor on that one. So
awesome.
Fun time. Again, bit of a night. It was great. Wasn't complicated. It was just mind-numbingly hard with all the different files that came in.
Yeah.
So I always tell that story. It's like, oh yeah, it's easy. It's a podcast. Just edit it. It's like, oh man, if you know video editing and multicamming, different frame rates and syncing audio, and dude, it's an absolute nightmare. So it was great. It was a fun project to work with Ironclad on, but yeah, it was definitely like, oh man, that was pretty rough.
one anecdote I did want to throw out. I will say it did give me an opportunity to fulfill a lifelong kind of dream, in that I got to give a tour to Bucky Lassick, which for those that don't know, he's a famous skateboarder. Genuinely a super awesome dude, really nice guy. And for me, it was like a full circle moment, because my 16-year-old self, when because Jared called me, he's like, hey, Bucky's gonna come by, he needs a tour. And I was like, yeah, of course I'll do that. Because when I was a kid, I had this old, and it was white, like Snow White VHS copy of this movie that was called Birdhouse: The End, right? Which was Tony Hawk's, still is Tony Hawk's outfit. But it was the first big cinematic skateboard film, or one of the first big skateboard films. And it was like him and Heath Kershaw and all these great skaters, and Bucky Lassick was in it. And, I still own that VHS, which I'm really proud of. The fact that it survived my entire, livelihood. And lo and behold, here I am interviewing this guy who, as a child skateboarder and even as an adult who still skateboards, I'm like, oh man, this is like the most awesome thing I've ever been able to do professionally.
Yeah.
Because he was
No, that
just
was
so down to earth and so genuine, and he was just honestly the nicest dude. He took time to talk to everybody that was there. There was nobody he was above. Like, it was great.
yeah. I met him. It was one of my last shoots. Doing that rally race or whatever. He came and like stopped by, and I was like, oh, Bucky Lacey. Like
Yep.
I wasn't a skateboarder. My brothers were, but I played Tony Hawk's Pro Skater,
Yep.
as we all did. And I was like, I love that. We love that game. And so I knew Bucky Lasik from that. So it was like, you guys are like a few years older into that, like really we're into him. And then there was like me and like a few other guys that were working that were like, oh, we know him from the video game.
Yep.
It's like, so it's just like, everyone was like excited. I was like, oh dude, this is like, it is a kind of a childhood moment. You're like, oh man,
Yep.
never thought I'd meet Bucky Lasik, but that's pretty dope.
Yep.
Spent hours playing as you and Tony Hawk, for hours listening to our CD player, next to us.
Oh, yeah.
I think it was PlayStation, but I think they did have a Nintendo 64 version, but I think we were playing the PlayStation one all the time.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. That was,
yeah.
that was one of the first games, I got when I was a kid, when it came to next gen gaming systems. I had a PlayStation, I had that and Metal Gear Solid, and
Nice.
I played them both to death. So,
Yep, absolutely. So then, this is a pretty, obviously it's a big deal. You're going. And, do you have like, I won't say ups and downs, but I'm saying is like, for people that are out there that are looking to do graphic design or even come from the military, like what's kind of the advice that you do have, either business side or creative side? We can, I'm sure there's a lot out there, but like, what was the lessons that you kind of learned, through the years, either creatively or business,
There's two, maybe three key lessons. Is, first and foremost is when you have a team of people, it tends to be the most rewarding aspect of creative work. So whenever given an opportunity to work with a team versus an individual, it's always much more rewarding, because oftentimes, especially if you're in a leadership position, you hire people for a reason, and you have to be willing to allow them to do that job that you hired them. You saw something in them that some other business didn't. And I've found that traditionally 99% of the time when they are given that opportunity, they're going to succeed, right? Because no one goes into something hoping they fail. And people need to, I feel like, especially from creative sides, mainly if you're in a leadership position, I would say, but make sure you understand that like no creative's going to come to you with the hope that they're going to fail at what you're giving them to do. And so, and on the other side of that, when you're that creative person, I think the most important lesson is to remember the audience, right? I think oftentimes artists forget their audience, and that's why they fail often, is because what they see in the art is something they're really passionate about, but they oftentimes forget who they're selling it to. And so having that objectivity and that understanding, I think, is paramount, because then that's how you get this, coalesced kind of mindset where everyone's on the same page. Like you have a boss that's expecting greatness and you're going, okay, who's the audience? What are we selling? How are we selling it? I'm going to design for that purpose. And, I always joke that, people say make the logo bigger, and I say make the logo better, because, it's understanding what you're doing at all times. What is the mission? What is this hope to gain? And everything you do has to have a purpose, right? Because if it doesn't, then you're just going to flap in the wind and there's nothing to be gained from it. And even if let's say the product fails, I don't believe in regrets. I never have. I've lived my entire life that way. There's no such thing, because no matter how negative an experience you have had, you learn how not to repeat that. And I think design is the best place for that kind of mindset, because, especially I would say with Black Rifle, you learn to fail fast, learn fast, move fast, right? You don't get hung up on feelings. You don't get hung up on caring. You're just like, look, this doesn't mean what I just did is a bad piece of art. It just means that what I just did doesn't meet what it needs to, right? Because this piece of art in some other place could be perfect, And so, but just learning that like, it doesn't work here doesn't make you a bad artist. It just means you need to rethink your process. And again, work with your leaders, work with the company, and figure out how to do what you're doing for the right purpose.
And then too, for like I don't say, like guys, people getting into the market, sometimes it can be tough,
Mhm.
starting out. Like I said, you had your ups and downs. Like I said, you guys were, scraping by. We all did the starving
Mhm.
artist type aspect. In 2025, what would you obviously if you had someone that was starting out now, I'm sure they do ask you, it's like, what should I do? What route should I take? How should I approach things? Because there's so many different ways to approach things. I mean, people come up to me all the time, like, well, maybe we should do this, and this, and um, you have the Fivers, you have, there's still obviously the freelancing. There's,
Mhm.
graphic design and corporate. How would, what advice would you give to somebody? Because you had a very successful career, like where, what advice would you give to somebody that's starting out and, how they should move forward?
Absolutely. I would say, you know, just to be fair to everybody, the way Jared and I started out wouldn't necessarily work for most people in this day and age because, excuse me, when we started, it was a lot of free work, right? It's just making a name for yourself, getting yourself out there, and doing the things, and eventually people will come to you, right? You get to build a rep for being good at what you do. Word of mouth travels way further than anything you're ever going to be able to do for yourself. That
Mm-hmm.
would be one lesson I would want to make sure most graphic designers do know, is that word of mouth is going to be your best friend when it comes to creative work. That portfolio is great, but as long as you have a good rep for being good to work with, that's what people care about the most. Can you deliver? You know, don't go into meetings if you're going to go the freelance route, which is a perfectly good route. If you do that, don't go into meetings telling people how awesome you are, because they don't care. They care that they have a vision and you can help them deliver that vision. That's all that matters. And, I've spoken at colleges before, and I would say one of the best starting piece of advice I can give people is, if you have an opportunity, intern whenever possible. Especially like if I go to a design college, I always say, when you're about that 2-year mark, try to start interning with stuff, because it's really important you learn what is practical knowledge and what is educational knowledge. And what I mean by that is, it's like, go back to military. We've all, you went to your MOS school, Air Force, we call it AFSC. Like, you go to your technical school, you learn all these skills. Not all that's going to apply when you get into the real world, and you're going to be lost if you think all that stuff is going to be applicable, and you're going to get really frustrated, and you're going to get really downtrodden, and you're actually going to have a pretty negative opinion of the job, right? Because you're like, I learned all these things. Why aren't we doing this? Like, because in the real world, these things don't apply the same way. And so I would say the best thing most creative people can do is, one, do an internship. Two, learn to have thick skin. I think that's true of any career field, but especially with art, anybody who goes on Google or reads a magazine is going to tell you what good art is. Doesn't matter who they are. And you just have to know that what you're doing is worth it to you. It has to, if you get into this field, and you could probably attest, you have to have a mission that is larger than yourself when you go into it. I feel like the most successful people I know that are in design have something bigger than them. They're not out to prove like, I'm a good artist. They're like, if I don't do good at my job, my kids don't eat, my wife doesn't eat, I lose my home. All of these things I feel are the most paramount reasons to push forward.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
That may not be that may not be the most clear path, but if I were to be honest with you, in this day and age, I think the concept of hard work, and again, it's like, get in early, get that experience in, learn what you can. And oftentimes, if you do good at those internships, those things parlay into jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And you may not get paid a lot coming out the gate, but don't get frustrated by that. Learn more business, get business savvy, because what ends up happening is you go from being an employee to being an asset to a company. Because an employee is a guy that comes in 9 to 5, checks off all the marks, does his job, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, that is perfectly fine to do. But when you want to become an asset to a company is when you start to not only provide solutions, but you offer solutions, and you start helping them solve problems that you see before they even know they're there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's great advice. I mean, I say it too. I started my career way later, knowing I wanted to do it. Like, it wasn't like, oh man, I fell into cinematography or
Yeah.
filmmaking and directing. It was like, oh no, I wanted this since I was 13. But finally getting into the field at like 28, 29, and sucking, doing the starving artist instead of at like 21, 22. I'm doing it at like 30, 31. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like, oh man, it's kind of sucks. But I do agree with you. I think as creatives, the free work, man, I actually found it, no pun intended, but I found it more liberating and free doing the free work because it gave me the opportunity to say, yeah, I will do this project. It's going to come out of my pocket. I get to film cool stuff because that's typically, generalities. Oh, I'm going to film some cool stuff, but it gives you full control over the edit because they're doing it for free. They'll take whatever you want. Typically that was my experience. It was like, yeah, I'll take whatever you can get, they'll show up with gear or they'll show up with whatever. Like we filmed for a Red Bull crashed ice athlete. The guys, all they had to do was show up and do some fun moves and training that they were doing. But for us, it was like, all right, I get to shoot it the way I want to shoot it. I can do it this way. There's no pressure and you can fail. And this works, this doesn't, we learned a bunch of stuff and it was great. And then when it came together in the edit and I could edit how I want to edit. And I think it does make you problem solve. And then it does give you, but it gives you that freedom because you don't have that pressure of like, oh, there's $1,000 on the line or $5,000 or $100,000 or something like that.
Oh yeah.
That's why I kind of do like that free work when you're doing something like, no, let me do my thing. You'll get the final product. Everyone's happy because they get a bunch of free, awesome content and you get to hone your skill and expand. And then you can it almost helps. It's like a nice stepping stone into the next whatever you're doing creatively.
Yeah.
So I do agree with you. Yeah. And interning as much as you can. I started off as an internship and then I end up working and editing. And honestly, editing is what kept me alive for a while because no one wants to edit. And I loved editing. So I just found a good niche. I mean, it was still a struggle, but you're starting out. No one's going to pay you, ass ton out the gate, and so that's why I agree with you. Interning and networking. I think that was,
100%.
And whatnot. So, and then you ended up, I think that's really great advice. And so you end up writing a book, what kind of inspired you to write, All Your Friends Are Imaginary, now available on Amazon or whatever, where can you pick it up at?
So I will tell this kind of unique story because you yourself are also a filmmaker. Mm-hmm. So part of, Jared and I's past is working a lot of independent film, whether it was we did our own commercials or we actually worked on film productions or like Range 15, all these different things. And so I had this idea of this book at the time called All Your Friends Are Imaginary. And it was essentially about how like kind of people in Hollywood are fake. Mm-hmm. And because they are, like you'll meet people one day, they're like, yeah, we're great friends. We're going to do this thing. And then like a week later, you can't find them. They're gone. They've ghosted you. And, I wrote like 7 chapters of the book and I thought it was pretty funny. And then I just kind of lost interest, ADHD mind, you just kind of move on to the other thing. And about 2 years ago, I was going through my stuff as one does when they're cleaning out things. And I found the manuscript for it. And I thought, I love the name, hate the idea for the book now. It's just not going to be interesting to read a book about independent filmmaking about a bunch of drunk Air Force guys doing dumb shit with a camera. Mm-hmm. So I kept the title and I started to think about all these different pieces of business advice that, I had learned or given or just kind of just ascertained from all these years of working from, at the age of 15 with a work permit. I wanted my first car and my mom's like, I'll give you a permit. You get a job. You save the money, you get the car, right? And even in that environment, you can learn something. You're never better than your last job. So every job you should be learning something to make the next job better. And so as I gained all this experience, I realized that there's a lot of situations where it's really tough on people. And I found that even as a leader, I spent quite a bit of my time in my office, sometimes talking to people who didn't quite understand, like, why can't you say this thing? Why can't you do that thing? Why is this way and that way? And I found that I was able to articulate that to people, just, very tactful. Tact is something I learned, and maybe just more of an Air Force thing, but I was always taught the mark of good tact was, if your commander wrongs you and you can walk into their office and you speak in such a way that you call him an asshole and you leave the room and he shakes your hand, then you've learned tact. Mm-hmm. And I know that's a really harsh example, but it's true. Like if you can do that and you can say those things and you can do it in a way that's respectful, then anything is doable. And so that's kind of what I wanted to do with this book is like teach people to understand, one, be polite, be professional, which is one of the pieces of advice in there, but also just how to navigate like interpersonal things that can happen in a business, conversations, situations, things you probably shouldn't even care about. One of my favorite pieces is the fail upwards thing. We've all seen it. There's people that you have worked with where you think they're the dumbest person you've ever met in their life, and they somehow just keep rising. in a business. And it's, when you start out, it gets really frustrating. You're like, what am I doing wrong? How am I not? And you realize like the things you probably have to do to be that person, you don't want to do those things or be that person. And so I felt that writing a book to teach people those skills would be really important because, no one did that for us, right? No one did that for Jared and I for 20 years while we were learning how to do these things. I'm sure no one did that for you. No one sat you down and said, hey, this is probably going to happen to you. Don't take it so personally, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's probably the biggest takeaway from the book itself is just like learn not to take everything personally because most people honestly don't care that you exist. Mm-hmm. And that's not, it's not a bad thing. It's not a good thing. It's just how the world works. Everybody's got their own life. And in a business place, it can get you down very quickly if you think too much about these things. And so I wanted a blueprint for people that was kind of like you're probably going to see this. Here's maybe a way you can deal with it. Yeah. And so, yeah.
No, go ahead. Keep going.
Oh, no. And so I realized once I started writing it, the first draft, I'm going to tell anybody here, was just mean. Like I read it. I was like, ooh, okay, I need to pull out the vinegar and salt on that version. And it wasn't mean. Like I was just saying stuff in a very like kind of straight way that wasn't approachable. And so, that was, the book, the version you've got is even, I think, like the 8th draft, because you start to read stuff and you're like, okay, maybe this won't work. Maybe that won't work. And I learned that I had to write it in such a way that was just more personal so people could take the lesson away from it. Because I kind of went into it writing from the perspective that you know more than you do. And so I had to peel it back and go, well, what if I've never learned this? How could I learn from this if I'm just reading this for the first time? And that to me was actually the best part about writing is learning to see things from the viewer's perspective.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. No, I agree with you. I think that's, something you learn more in the corporate environment. But I remember learning that a long time ago when I was, the company doesn't care about you. You're still a number, and, there's no loyalty, or if and again, and it's a little harsh, but I remember, you kind of have to look out for yourself. Like I worked for, the Blackwater, whatever company they were at the time, like IDS and everything. It's like, you're holding out for this because you kind of want to be loyal to them. You're young. You're like, oh yeah, this is a great, whatever. And then you just kind of realize at the end of the day, you're just a number. You're someone doing a job. You're replaceable. Yeah, you got more skills than most of the U.S. population, and that's why they're paying you the amount they're paying you. But at the end of the day, there's going to be another Marine coming out of the gate. There's going to be another guy that's going to try to apply, and they just don't care. Contracts don't care, And so I remember learning that a long time ago, like within the first year I was out of the Marine Corps, and also obviously in the military too. It's like sometimes you're just a number, at the end of the day. And not to get too harsh about it again, but there's no, I don't want to say brand loyalty, but there's no like, look, they'll eat you up and spit you out. But again, that, and then at the same time, I come from this because I own my own business. And I'm like, look, man, it's just business. Sometimes like, I'm not mad that, it's like so when people get kind of upset or like, oh my God, I can't believe this. Like, yeah, you can bitch about it, but then at the same time, like, don't, like that's the thing that kind of gets me sometimes when companies like, we're a family. I was like, we're not a family. There's no family here. No, I'm a number to you. You will throw me out. You know what I mean? Like I can do the best work in the world for you. But at the end of the day, if you need to cut a budget and it's, if you're my boss or whatever, and it's, even if I'm outperforming you, at the end of the day, you're going to cut me before you because it's just like a survival game. It's still a business, like that's just how it's played. But, say can't take it personal, but I like what you say too. It's like your reputation will follow you. So if you're a good dude, and, people recommend you, then, most of my work comes recommended, which is great. And that's where you want to be at, but yeah, I mean, when it comes to company and stuff like that, I do agree with you. I think, and maybe, even my wife got let go. She was at 3M for 10 years. And it's like, hey, I kind of helped her through that. She picked up a job right away somewhere else, which was great. But she was, a little shaken. That was her first job out of college. And if you've been somewhere and they preach loyalty, they teach, everybody wants to come to 3M. That's where you go to retire. That's where all the good, the good benefits, the good job, the stability, always hear that, but then when it's just like, yeah, we don't care. We'll sell your whole division, 10,000 people gone in a day. You kind of just, especially those companies, there's no loyalty. There's no family. There's no loyalty. You just got to look out for yourself.
Yeah. And
And I think,
and there's sometimes too where there's like incidences like, and as I'll tell anybody who asks me about the book, it's not written about any one company or any one person. This isn't like a tell-all thing about places I've worked. It's more of a history of having worked with a lot of different corporations, some publicly traded, some not. Specifically, there was an incident, I want to say post-military, like right after I got out, and this was kind of where I would say, to your point, you really start to pay attention to things. I was working I'll just say a big box retailer, post-military. I was getting my business back up and running. I was going to college and I was doing this full-time job, right? And so basically 3 jobs at one time, because you do what you do when you got kids. Doesn't matter. Sleep doesn't matter. And I remember one day we're in the store, we're resetting for a certain sale. And, we hear a commotion in the parking lot, right? There's like yelling and screaming. People are people. You're kind of curious, like, what's going on over there? And we look out the front door and there's this husband and wife and they're parked in a parking spot. And kid you not, the husband has his hand on like the driver's side door and he is just wailing on his wife with his fist, like just nonstop. So, we call the police, a couple of guys go out through the car, kind of separate the two. And I remember the cops came in, the guy made a huge commotion, got hauled off, he's beating his wife in the parking lot. And I had called the police because I'm like, well, that's, breaking the law. You're like assaulting somebody and there's abuse. And I remember my first taste of bureaucracy and corporate kind of thought processes was getting taken outside immediately after the incident and getting counseled and scolded for having called the police and told never to do that again.
Really?
Yeah. I had a manager who was like, all those decisions need to come through me next time. And I'm like, really, man? It's like, really? And I get it. They don't want to, and I get it. They didn't want to, you don't want to see in the store, but I knew this person and I knew their personality. And I know for a fact that if it had been left to them, they probably would have never said a word. They probably would have just let it happen and moved about their life. And so for me, that stage was set early on to where I maybe didn't have the best opinion of corporate culture, but I was still mindful enough with business and other things that I could navigate both worlds of kind of like corporate, non-corporate. But that was definitely one that has stuck with me for a long time of like why, you have to be willing to do what feels wrong, but is absolutely right. And the corporations sometimes will tell you quite the opposite.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
No, I
sorry, I didn't mean to bring it down. It was just more of like,
that was a great podcast. Yeah.
Awesome, guys. Make it fun. Yay. But I tell that story so people understand like where I come from on this kind of stuff, where I've seen the dirtiest. I feel like that's a dirty side of corporate culture where they're like, they will do anything to protect themselves, like anything. And to your point, they'll cut people after 10 years of work with no thought process. It's like, goodbye. And they won't think anything of it. They'll give you a couple months severance and call it a day and good luck. See you later.
Yeah.
And that's honestly kind of to segue where the title of the book comes from, because I felt like the title was still apt, because when you're in business, you realize that you come and go from a job, and more often than not, when you leave a job, and if you have a good rep when you leave a job, quite a few people actually stick around and talk. Obviously, we're on this podcast and we haven't worked together in years, but there's a lot of times where once you leave, you disappear to people. Like their texts don't come through anymore. Their calls don't come through anymore. Your utility to that individual has ceased to exist. And so you cease to exist. And again, the title is kind of an allusion to the fact of another secret piece of advice when you're in a business place is that, no one really honestly cares that you're there. As long as you're doing your job, that's what matters to them. And that's the only thing that matters.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. and I think that's look, I think that's, everybody wants to kind of approach things with rose-colored glasses. Yeah. Although I do feel like, I don't know, this is to go comment too much into the culture, but you do feel a little bit or more of that shift. Everyone talks about the 50s where, you work 20, 30 years, you get your pension, they get your Rolex, and company cares about their people. And I feel like now people, I think, approach more of like what we've learned, but now right away. So like, if you're like a kid, you're like, no, you know what I mean? Like you're being taught by your parents. Like I have kids, you have kids, that, hey, if they ask us for advice, like what's going to happen? It's not like, hey man, you need to stay at one company. Like it's evolved very rapidly where, It's shifted where it's like, if you have like 10 companies on your resume, they're like, oh, you got a lot of experience. Wonder what, cause it's like, I'm here to improve myself. I want more money and I think I'm worth it. So I'm willing to go after it, opposed to like, I remember it was taboo, like maybe even 10 years ago, where you were like, why do you have so many things on your resume? Like why did you go through so many companies? It's like a flip flop. Now, not saying that's true for every aspect, but you can definitely feel a cultural shift into, I'm going to look out for me, which is what you should. I think that is something as a surviving mentality. But yeah, it's I think a lot of people put a lot of their trust into the stability of these of companies. And at the end of the day, it's still a bottom line. When people get upset, I'm like, hey man, still at the end of the day, it's still a bottom line. It may not be a good one, but make sure you got your nest egg, make sure you got your resume. There was it was actually really cool. And I appreciate, she's sadly has now passed on. One of my wife's coworkers that she was much older. She's probably 10, 15 years older. And she would actually interview for other companies like every 6 months to a year. Even though she wasn't planning on leaving, she would go through the whole process to like stay sharp and to know that like at any moment you could, pop smoke, if it's not going your way, or maybe they're not paying you enough or whatever, or, I'm just not quite vibing here. You can go to another company and they just might be like, yeah, we'd love to hire you. Be like, hey, you know what? Thank you. I'm still happy with my job now. And, but at least you stay sharp and know that there's a market out there, there's, and I actually thought that was a piece of great advice. I think maybe as us as like, creative freelancers, we're always looking for the next job, like as we're working on one, you're like, all right, I gotta, like, what's the next one,
Yeah.
But in a corporate mentality though, which most people are in, that's always good to say, where's the exit? What's my, E&E plan? What's my next step?
Well, I think that, it keeps you proficient because you also then know, what current market trends are and what people are looking for in applications. Again, it's like there's a piece of advice I put in the book about, resumes, right? If your resume is not improving every 6 months, then you're doing something wrong. You're in the wrong job. And I will stand firmly by that statement, because you should always be improving your last bullet point in your resume. You should always be striving for something better. And even if you're freelance, what does that look like, right? Well, that looks like you go for the bigger fish, you go for the bigger client. And kind of there's a trick to it. I mean, I wouldn't say it always works, but the trick is you have to be crazy. Right? You have to be willing to put yourself out there and say, I'm going to do this audacious thing for you, and you deliver on it. And every time you deliver on it, that just gives you more fuel, more ammunition to build that rapport to where you have that growth. So in like a freelance environment, that's how you get that extra, oomph, is like, okay, you go from the client that's paying you $100 a month for a club flyer, been there, done that, to the client that's paying you $2,500 a month for packaging design and product photography or whatever else, to a client that's paying you $5,000, $10,000, whatever it happens to be. And that's growth based on, I've done these things. I've made my bones. I've built this thing. I have the rep for it. And that's more of like, to your point, the freelance world. In the corporate world, you have to be willing to go to your boss and say, look, I know you have this problem. I'm going to help you solve it. And you have to be willing to roll up your sleeves and do the dirty work, right? I will say this for myself, but, even when I was in like a senior director position, like a lot of people don't realize, like there would be late nights where I would sit and I would still like go into designs and fix small things. And it's kind of the ghost in the machine mentality, but I never complained. I never went after my team. I never was like, oh man, you're an idiot. You did this wrong. It was more of like, I'm just going to fix this, right? I'm going to spend more time telling you kind of what happened and whatever, blah, 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 instead of just fixing the problem and then just doing the thing. And the same thing with my leaders. I would go to them and I'd say, look, I will put in the time, energy, and effort. Let's just do the thing. Let's just get it going. And that mentality took me pretty much from, that entry level contract graphic designer all the way to the senior director brand job, because every step of the way, I never looked back on the last thing I did as being less than. I always looked at it as a stepping stone to the future of things. And every time I'd make that step, to your point, you want to grow in the corporate environment, man, you got to be a little bit crazy. You got to be willing to just do the thing, because especially in a startup, everything seems crazy. It's a pirate ship.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And everything you do is going to be like, how do we solve this problem? No idea. In a corporate world, trust me, a lot of things we did and said probably would be highly frowned upon, but it's what we knew we needed to do for us to make that situation, that system, whatever it was, work. And that to me, I guess to go back on your question before, would honestly be one of the most rewarding things too, is being in a place that took risks and watching those calculated risks pay off as well.
That's awesome. Well, that's a positive note to end on.
Yes, absolutely.
There we go. That was great. That was awesome. Awesome. Well, where can people find you? Where can you find your book? And where can they find you? Like, hey man, Gary's the shit. I love his designs. Where can I get a hold of you?
So the book is on Amazon. Again, it's called All Your Friends Are Imaginary, and Other Important Business Advice, which I had to throw that little moniker in there. I'm on Instagram under my name. It's like Gary_Stevens_art. And those are really the only two places I have. I've got a LinkedIn if anyone cares, it's out there. It just kind of shows my work history though. Nothing fun or interesting. I don't have a .com. I don't have a website. Clients ask for my portfolio and I send it, and that's usually how business goes from there. I found out a long time ago maintaining a website it's for other people. So
yeah, I get it. Yep,
awesome.
I get it. Well, awesome. Well, thanks for coming on, brother.
Absolutely, man. Appreciate you having me. Thank you.